Hello, we're back, and this set of video lectures can get very involved. This involves coding diseases and disorders of the cardiovascular system. This is one set of video lectures where I'll be giving you some supplemental material on the page that has the video that would be helpful for you to read while you're going through these exercises and going through the video lectures itself. And again, this is covering diseases of the circulatory system, covering codes categories I00 through I99, including I10 for hypertension. Hypertension, incidentally, is the most common reason for an office visit in the United States. Let's take a look at this. Skip over these. I'll let you read those on your own. And we have different categories. We have code categories for acute rheumatic fever, chronic rheumatic fever, hypertensive diseases, ischemic heart diseases, pulmonary heart disease, and other forms of heart disease. And again, if you think about these and how the chapter is arranged, sometimes this will help you. If you know something is acute rheumatic fever, it's going to fall in these code categories I00 through I02. This chapter also covers cerebrovascular diseases, strokes, diseases of the arteries. Strokes and cerebral vascular disease falls in I60 through I69, and of course, diseases of arteries, I70 through 79. We can also have diseases of the veins, lymphatic vessels, and lymph nodes falling into I80 through 89. And then, of course, anything that's unspecified falls into the I95 through I99. Here's something that gets confusing to people, and you'll see this documented in the record, so please pay attention to what I have here for you. A lot of times we'll see acute myocardial infarctions, otherwise known as heart attacks, known as STEMI and non-STEMI. With the STEMI, the ST segment on the EKG is elevated, hence the name. The non-ST elevation, the NSTEMI, doesn't have that elevation. With the non-STEMI, it involves the full thickness of the myocardial wall, where the STEMI is an entire blockage. STEMIs are generally more serious, and let's take a closer look at these so we can understand how to code them. You can see here on an EKG, otherwise known as an ECG, we have this section here, which is the ST segment, and you can see how it's elevated in the STEMI, right? So it's ST elevation MI. Notice here that we don't have a complete blockage. It's nearly blocked, but there's still a little bit of space in here. Let me fix that. And again, why is it called a non-STEMI? Because you don't have that elevation, right? So rather than get into the weeds about the QRS waves and all these other things, it's enough to know this section here, the ST segment, elevated, non-elevated, normal, non-elevated, and then elevated. And also from the Cleveland Clinic, and if you're interested in more information on this, I'm going to post this for you. There's a total blockage. This is why this is considered more severe and why we want to pick it up. Note here, because of this clot, there is no blood flow over here. Note also that the ST segment is elevated. And again, we have several different code categories for myocardial infarction, right? And they're I21, I22, I23, and important to read what these are, whether they're subsequent and acute, whether they're initial, and whether they're STEMI and non-STEMI. Their code categories I-21, I-22, I-23, and the key here is to read the documentation. And if we have a subsequent myocardial infarction of one type, and it happens within a 4-week window, 4-week not being defined as 28 days of an initial myocardial infarction, we would assign the code of I-21 to each type, right? We only use the I-22 if both the initial and the subsequent are type 1 or unspecified. And again, we'll go through some examples on this and give you plenty of practice so you get the opportunity to understand this. It sounds confusing right now, but an important thing is to just work your way through the documentation and look for these things, paying particular attention to, is it within 28 days? Is it type 1 or is it unspecified? And again, if it's a type 1, as we mentioned, it's going to be assigned to I-21.0 through I-21.4. Type 2, in other words, myocardial infarctions that are due to demand ischemia or secondary to some sort of imbalance, are going to be I-21.A1. It is not going to be coded as I-24.8, right? And depending on this, if it's what the underlying cause is, it could be described as a STEMI or non-STEMI, right? When a type 2 MI is described as a non-STEMI or a STEMI, it only gets a code I-21.A1. Codes I-21.01 through I-21.4 is only for the type 1s. So again, way to think about this, you may want to take some notes. If it's type 2, it's going to be this. If it's type 1, it's going to be 21.01 through 21, I-21.4. Besides type 1 and type 2, we have type 3, 4A, 4B, 4C, and 5, and they go to the subcategory I-21.A9, other. And there's some important code also and code first notes that you will need to follow related to any complications of these and post-procedural MIs following cardiac surgery. There are a lot of guidelines involving hypertension, hypertension with heart disease, hypertension with chronic kidney disease, hypertensive heart and chronic kidney disease, and hypertensive cerebral vascular disease, and hypertensive retinopathy. We'll take a closer look at these in the next set of video lectures.